Hey, Chris.
What's up, Jason? I can see you in person this time.
I didn't even know we were starting this.
Yeah, surprise recording. It's because I get to control starting the recording this time, and it's always your job. So I'm going to play those like intro, outro things.
We probably... Oh, there it is. Oh, they changed it.
Ah.
I wonder if it just randomly generates per browser.
I don't know.
I think it's stored in some kind of local storage because I cleared my cache, or not cache, but I cleared everything out of Chrome and it was all there again. So
it could be just loads it locally and whatever. Although it seems like if you're building software for recording, podcasts online, that you would sync it online so that it is available if you switch computers, but
minor details.
Yeah.
You said that before we started, you said we've never talked in person before. I was like, wait a second.
Yeah, that's the secret that no one knows about the podcast.
We just don't talk when we see each other in public. We shared a room at RailsConf. It was just no eye contact.
Yeah, it's funny because we recorded at RailsConf, but we didn't talk to each other. Not really, because it was just like, hey, we're interviewing Nate Berkopec and Justin Searles. So it was like, we'll introduce them and just ask them questions and give them the microphone, basically.
When I went to edit Justin's episode, you started so enthusiastic, and I kept having to trim out sound, so I kept listening to the first 3 seconds over and over. It's like, hey, Jason. I was like, man, Chris is way more excited about recording and all these people than I am. So.
That's funny. Yeah, this time we are recording in an actual room, not in the hallway, and not near the surface elevator.
We could have.
Or those people welding in the ceiling last time. It was not good. So yeah, if anybody hasn't known, or I don't know if we've said exactly, but we're at Southeast Ruby in Nashville for your conference.
Our conference.
I didn't do anything. So.
Yeah, we're here, our third year, and today is workshop day. And so the last 2 years, we've started conferences, conference days both days. So today's been different because I'm doing a lot more sitting around than I anticipated. And
you've never done workshops at this before either.
This is the first time.
Yeah. So how do you think it's going so far? I mean, it's easy for you to be like, well, it's great. It's real easy.
It's great. I've been on Twitter for most of the day because there's nothing for me to do. But also I don't have the mental energy to go to a workshop. And Shana was like, hey, why don't you go to this workshop? I was like, hey, I don't want to think right now.
Yeah, said you had a lot going on yesterday before the conference.
Yeah, but I think it's going well. I
was at Ernesto's talk workshop on upgrading Rails. That went pretty well. We basically cloned an app that he had kind of prepped for us a little bit. Got it all set up with Docker so that everybody would get the exact same environment. We could kind of work through upgrading Rails 4.2 to 5.0 and the process on that, which went pretty well. The workshops were 3 hours long.
Yeah.
Like that. So there's a lot of waiting for downloading of Docker stuff.
I was going to ask how that went because I was scared that would cripple the Wi-Fi.
No, I had already downloaded Docker. A couple people didn't.
Okay.
It took them maybe 25 minutes or something.
That's not terrible, though, because it didn't cripple. It kept going. Yeah, I kept testing it throughout because I knew your workshop had Docker, and then I don't think Jason's did. But then there, right now, a Docker workshop is going on, too.
Yeah.
And I've been able to use the internet just fine. So.
Yeah, Andrew Famera was messaging me on Slack about Noah Gibbs' workshop on rebuilding Rails. He said it was really good, so I'm excited. Cool. He was giving his book away for free today.
Oh, cool. Which is also about rebuilding Rails. Yeah.
So I'm going to have to check that out afterwards because we're Well, I had a phone call, and so I missed it, and then we're recording instead. So catch up afterwards, but it sounded like it's pretty good. It's probably the same one he gave at Railstorm.
It is. Yeah, I was talking to him about it just now because I got that book, and I even admit to him I didn't finish it like everything else in my life. But I got that book as a part of like a Ruby bundle that like him, Justin Weiss, and a bunch of, I don't remember all the people. It was like 5 or 6 Ruby books, and they put it as like a package on Gumroad in 2015. And so I started, and I was like, this is perfect, and like this is really cool. And then like something shinier came along. So.
Yeah. That is how it is. I have a bunch of books that way that I'm like, hardly anymore. I just buy it because I want to support the author and like help them make more stuff. You know?
Sure.
Like I bought Adam Lathan's Vue course, watched one lesson maybe, and that was it.
I actually have refactoring to collections, which is a PHP like Laravel. I think it might even be like Laravel collection specific book. Because I assume like enumerables in PHP like don't have these built-in like functions around that. I'm not really sure to be honest, but I know in Laravel like there's an entire like collection package. So like I was just working on Laravel code and like I had an array of stuff and I wanted to like iterate over it. Like in Ruby I'd say like .each, you know? And so I just wrapped it in like a collection function and then called .each on it.
Oh, nice.
Provided
like
closure.
Helper methods for that. So some of that stuff must not be built into PHP, I guess.
That, or it might be built in, but maybe it's like...
It's probably changed now that there's newer PHP.
There might not be... Maybe they like want a specific API around it. Maybe like... I know...
Like enumerable in Ruby?
Yeah, because I remember when I like first started PHP, criticism was things are kind of inconsistent. Like, what was it? It was, what's the needle, what's the haystack kind of thing, and maybe there was some of that with functions, but I don't know. I'm just being ignorant. But, yeah, so I have that book, but I wasn't doing a ton of PHP at the time. I also bought test-driven Laravel.
Oh, yeah. That's
like, years ago, or a couple of years ago, whenever I released it. But
yeah, I just listened to the interview with him on Indie Hackers and talk about his... I forget, he made $600,000 or something the first day or whatever on the refactoring UI book, something like that. And it's awesome.
I think like you like look at every product he's built though, and like they like build on one another, not in terms of like necessarily the content, but
his reputation,
and
everything.
His
quality went way up,
and you kind of watch him progress just as a developer, like started refactoring collections, TDD, Laravel, the Vue course, and then now refactoring UI.
Yeah, he talked about working with Steve to like, because a lot of those design tips that Steve posts were like things he would never think about because they were like, just why wouldn't you do that? You know,
right.
Second nature to him. And it's cool to see their collaboration there because like they've gone and taught design to developers in a way that makes sense to developers, but I've always seen like there's some other good stuff that's been out there, but it's not resonated as well. Like Mackenzie Child did a bunch of design for developers things.
Yeah, I have that course
and whatever, and those are all good, but nothing really struck it as big as they did, which is pretty cool to see.
I think a lot of that was Steve's like fire hot tips that he posts on Twitter. Like I remember
they said they stole that from Wes Bloss was doing the
the emoji things. Yeah, because I remember that was a thing that Adam had just started doing when I met Adam, and then Steve just started doing it. But like Steve's tips were like, they felt like no brainers, but you, like you said, like you just wouldn't think of them.
Yeah, stuff like, you probably know that you need shadows, but having like a vertical offset instead of horizontal or something.
Just saying like, I need a shadow.
Yeah. Yeah.
it's like you can make that look really bad.
Yeah, oh yeah. And that's definitely something I've done. Or like you don't know you need a shadow or like a barely any gradient or something, and then you know something's missing, and then they add one thing, like the shadow, and all of a sudden it feels polished, and you're like, but how it's so subtle. Like how come I didn't notice that? And it's because it's so subtle.
I can't wait for, we've talked about this, like Tailwind. I don't know the word for it, but essentially like Tailwind components made by essentially Adam and Steve.
Yeah.
I feel like they talked about that online.
I think they're working on that. He was making a bunch of screencasts.
I think he still is, yeah.
And I think it's part of that, maybe. I know Steve had made a bunch of designs of actual UIs. And I watched a live stream or something of Adam implementing one of those, like Airbnb search navigation thing, cool. Which is neat.
Oh, come on, Chris.
So
Party foul.
Yeah, I don't have headphones like I do normally.
To catch all your incoming.
Yeah, it's nice that we can record like this, but not being able to have the exact same setup is kind of tough.
It is nice. It feels less awkward than when because we don't record with video, we just record with audio.
Yeah, and there's always because we don't have a video stream, there can't ever be like a visual thing, like you want to say something and interrupt, so we end up interrupting a lot.
Yeah, that's something I noticed because I had to edit the last few episodes, which was nice because I could, every time I'd step over you, I'd just cut it out so nobody knows. But,
that's funny.
Yeah. I don't even know what we're talking about.
I don't either. We didn't really have a plan for this episode. I just got back from, a trip to Germany, and now I'm at Southeast Ruby, and I feel like I haven't really been able to catch up on things. Traveling is fun, but when you're trying to get work done, contact switching is hard. That's the lesson learned.
Trying to think. So I've been doing a lot of Stripe, SCA stuff.
Yeah, how's that going? Because I need to upgrade every application that has Stripe in it, which I think most people do. Because supposedly, so even though this SCA stuff is strong customer authentication for the EU, Stripe has warned people that, like, even if you're a US business that has lots of EU customers, you need to go do that, which does make sense. Like, the banks over there might just see lots of transactions coming from you and say, well, we're going to,
what's going on?
Yeah. And that's quite a change, because now you don't have you click a button, you receive a true or false, success. Now you have to wait on webhooks to process things.
So it depends on what you're doing. So like our storefronts for our customers, if they're selling a product, it is just a synchronous checkout, right? Like their customer provides a card, you get a token, and then you try and create a Stripe charge is the terminology, as you know, because you pay. And so like that changes now because you have to create a payment intent. And when that comes through, like when you create the payment intent, you have to say like, it's for this amount of money. I want to use this card again, or I don't. Like, we need to store this, or we don't need to store it. And then you get a response back from Stripe that's like, they need to authenticate this, or this is good. And so if it's good, that actually doesn't interrupt our process at all.
Oh, okay.
But if it requires authentication, then I've got to go back to the client side and be like, trigger this Stripe method. It's like handle payment, which is really nice because it takes care of the authentication. Like in the most like Stripe way you would think, it like pops up a modal and you just say like confirm or deny.
And that's waiting for like you on your phone to, authenticate or something.
So I don't know because
there's like that 3D Secure, which
Secure
is similar or something.
So it's part of it. Like I've been the cards I'm testing with are 3D secure test cards.
Okay. See, I've always seen that in the Stripe docs and never
Right.
used one. So I never knew.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Because, like, the thing was, like, SCA is, like, 2 out of 3 factors. One was something you know, like a password, something you are, which was, like, your thumbprint.
Okay.
Or something you have,
Physical,
which is, like
a phone.
texting your phone a code or something. So it seems like it's a good thing for consumers,
Totally.
but it also sounds scary for someone like me who does subscriptions, because all of a sudden it sounds like those, long-term subscribers will start having a lot more failed payments.
So that's actually really interesting, and that
will affect your membership.
Yes.
To Podia, right?
So that's what I'm working on now, because that.
Also, before we dive into that, those payment intents, do you have to store those in your database?
So.
Or cookies or something?
So the payment intent can be stored. So a payment intent contains a payment method. These are like Stripe terms.
It's like your Stripe token.
Yeah, it's like a source. Yeah. So a payment method is like a source. And so actually the first thing I did was I updated all our charge APIs, not necessarily like the actual creation of charges, but where we reference like a charge.source or something like that. They've set it up to where there's new methods that charge understands that are the same methods that payment understands. So it's essentially, it's like they're duck typing in a way. Like if you have an existing charge or you have like this payment method or payment intent, you can use either one and call the same methods on it.
Huh.
So taking that, like if you store a Stripe charge ID, I assume you would just store a Stripe payment intent ID and then load them, retrieve them however one would.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
And so like instead of like charge.source, it's like charge.payment details or something like that.
Huh.
So
boy, it went from something that was hard to accept credit cards online to something that was easy with Stripe, and now back to something that was hard, all thanks to the European Union.
Well, so you said something that when people ask me like how SCA is going, I say like, as a consumer, that sounds awesome.
Right.
As a developer, it still sounds awesome. It just sounds less awesome, in terms of implementation.
It's just like the cookie pop-ups, on every website. Like
right.
That, in theory, is good for consumers, but the implementation of it is not understood by the people making the laws.
Now everyone just clicks accept, without thinking about it.
No one reads it. No, it doesn't do any good anymore. And it probably never did any good in the first place, but I get the intention, and it's just one of those things that you need better ruling from someone who understands technology or advice from them.
I think with SCA though, don't quote me on this. Don't quote me on anything ever. I think
quote you on that.
Quote me on that.
Quote you on not quoting you.
I think with SCA though, as a company, you are protected. So somebody can't try and do a chargeback if they.
Oh, that's right.
So,
which is interesting because Stripe also just rolled out their
chargeback protection. Yeah. So that's like a company benefit. So it hasn't been the charge API. Yeah, and it's just hard. It was just hard for me to wrap my head around because I've spent so many years just charging cards and that's it.
Well, I remember when I first implemented Stripe for the very first time, I had a hard time wrapping my head around it too, because it was the important piece of Stripe is that the credit card never touches your server.
Right.
So when you submit that form in your browser, it's not going directly to your server like it normally is. JavaScript takes the card number, and Stripe's HTML is set up so that your input fields don't even have names, so they can't get sent over on accident, which is that's pretty smart. And then once you understand that, it makes a lot more sense. But now you got to go deal with payment intents, and they sound intuitive, but when you're well, how does this change But the biggest thing is like, it takes now time for you to click pay and then for them to, send you a text message or you put your fingerprint in on your phone or whatever to authenticate. Like, that's no longer something that you're just like one step process. It's now your software has to listen to webhooks to determine whether or not something was done, and then you have to mark it as fulfilled. And
let's get
on.
Let's get into that. So charges are not that complicated. The only thing that makes it more complicated is if you have to authenticate, you have to fire back to where you were. And so, like, for me, I just return JSON, like, say, hey, we need to authenticate, and then Stripe, JavaScript picks it up, handles it, resubmits. We're cool.
So you're making an AJAX request to the server when you submit, and then returning some JavaScript to say, hey, Stripe, we need to do this extra authentication.
And so
because normally, like, I just implement it as a regular post, not AJAX-y, and then if the Stripe, charge error or whatever it is gets raised, then we render the new action again or something.
So you could do that. You would just have to find a way to like tell your view that, hey, actually we need to authenticate. I don't know if you do that with like a param or something, or
probably do an instance variable. Or something.
Just be like requires authentication and then trigger. Our process was already
Ajax.
It's Rails GJS. So actually
everything needs to be, because it's got to be TurboLinks mobile compatible.
So we actually don't have TurboLinks in right now, but I think we might change that anyway. So subscriptions. This whole process, like you said, it seems straightforward. So 2 weeks ago I said, oh yeah, I got us on like the latest Stripe gem versions. I got us on the latest API. And then on Monday 2 weeks ago, I looked at SCA and, hey, like, I think I'm going to have something for you by the end of the week. And 2 weeks later, I am like still bashing my head against the wall. But so like the problem has been, I like write how I think it's supposed to work. And then I realize when I'm done that that's probably not how it's supposed to work. Right. And so it's a lot of like drawing, erasing.
Yeah.
And so, go ahead.
Just like, I don't mean to interrupt, but I'm going through that process on a project right now where we're building scheduling software, and our spec, if you read it as a human being, makes sense. We've read it a million times. Seems like we covered all our bases, and sounds like the code's going to be simple to write. And I felt the same way reading the Stripe SCA stuff.
It's like 5 steps.
Yeah, it's like, it seems reasonable, and I understand the like changes at a high level. Then when you get to actually writing the code, like, those two don't jive.
Yeah.
And you like start to realize like the spec isn't actually telling me the literal next step. It's kind of like, and then you just go do this.
Yeah.
And it's like
a little hand wavy.
Yeah, where it's like even something as simple as like, do you need to save the payment intent in the database? If they tell you yes or no, or just, give you that level of detail, it's one thing. But when they don't really in their docs, then you're sitting there like, well, I didn't save it, and now I've made it to a step or two later in the process, and now I need the payment intent ID again, and I don't have it. So now I got to rewrite stuff.
Yeah.
It's a very tough thing to do when you're programming, is like write the spec that detailed ahead of time. Because it's something that like crops up when you go to implement. You notice those things that weren't as clear, and you get better at it over time, but like it's not possible to really think that granular, until you're sitting down coding sometimes. Just thought that was an interesting point.
That's another thing too, is like when you're doing charges, I can't remember exactly the order, but like the first thing I actually send is a payment method ID from Stripe. Okay. Like that, instead of a token, I have a payment method.
Okay.
And when I go back to, if I have to go back, then I actually have an intent ID.
Instead of the...
Right. And
because it effectively is creating a session to keep track of all the things that happen
Right.
for that. Because I could imagine maybe there's situations where you put in your card number and then you use your like text message or something option, then you realize your phone's dead, so then you have to do something else or whatever. Like, probably allows you to keep all those to track in the same event, more or less, but makes it more complicated.
So I promise we're going to get subscriptions. But the other thing with charges, payment intents, whatever, single one-time purchases, is that there are two types. There's what they call automatic, and then there's manual. And automatic is the one that reads the webhooks, which works great, in my opinion, if you're an e-commerce company that ships like physical goods. Because, like, oh God, drag racers outside. So if I sold record players and somebody placed an order and they need to do SCA, like, I'll just go ahead and create the order, but I won't mark as like ready to fulfill or anything. It'll just be in like this incomplete state. And then a webhook can come in and be like, okay, now we need to fulfill this order. And that's what they consider, I guess, the automatic, where I'm not ready to do that yet. So we're doing the manual way, which is why we're going back and forth. Versus I'm not doing the webhook approach here. I'm just going back to the client, then back to the server.
Yeah.
So I'm like, I'm playing ping pong with it versus just like throwing it up in the air. And
interesting. Yeah, because I was wondering about that too, where it was like, if you're subscribing to GoRails and you put in your card number and then you need to authenticate and a webhook comes in, how do I actually... I mean, I'm going to have to pull something in the database to...
You have to create you essentially have to create the subscription, which now leads us to subscriptions. So that's what I think.
Oh, yeah, like a pending subscription or something?
Right, which is not a concept we have in our system. So that's where, like, I've been kind of tripped up, and I was talking to CTO before I left. Like, literally, I called him, we talked through it, and then now I'm here. And, like, we're going to have to just implement the idea of
pending.
Yeah, because like I can't just put it in a transaction because that'll throw away the subscription. And then, like, the intent was for that subscription. So now they're like severed, and you'd have to go through the whole process again, which would just be an infinite loop of never getting a subscription.
Yeah.
So I don't.
Wow.
There's like a way to do it manually once again, but I think it's going to be, I think for one-time charges, the manual process works fine. I think for subscriptions, it's just going to introduce more complexity than.
That's interesting, because we're going to have to update the PageM for that. I'm going to update Jumpstart and Hatchbox and GoRails. And like, one thing I may do because Hatchbox and GoRails were built before Pay. And I have like two different implementations of those. And the Hatchbox is like a prototype of what Pay became.
Mm.
So what I'm probably going to do for that one is just make it Pay compatible. Just like migrate my data into new column names and whatever else needs to be compatible. GoRails, though, like, that code is not real great. Like, I have a subscription ID on a user, not subscription. You know, like, when you cancel, I delete the subscription ID. And, like, it's not great. So, but it was before I really understood, like, how to cleanly organize the data. I was going for simplicity then, and it works, but, like, I have no historical data now on subscriptions and stuff. And so that's been, like, kind of a pain. Mm-hmm. So, you know, it needs reworking, and I'm sure many people's, like, payments implementations end up that way too. But yeah, it'll be interesting because basically, when I get back from Southeast Ruby, like that's going to be one of the things to do soon because it happens. That goes into effect mid-September or something, and I'm gonna get that stuff updated ahead of time. But I'm gonna update the payments course for that, which is this is funny because like I've made this payments course that I've never talked about really, and so this is maybe the first time I'm talking about it publicly. And of course, we're recording at a hotel, and someone decides to start vacuuming in the hallway.
My room isn't even near anything. So.
But I'm going to go redo that course again and update it with all this new Stripe subscription stuff and SEA.
You should try and promote it after you do that. So it's worth your time.
Yeah. Well, I finished. So I did it the first time. I was never really happy with it. And then I redid it. As I was finishing it was when we started working on Pay. And I was like, I should, because I wanted to do not just Stripe, but Braintree. And then Pay is wrap around both. So I was going to just kind of do all three. Here's an introduction to Stripe, an introduction to Braintree. But actually, you should still just use Pay. But at least you understand how it works under the hood. So I'm going to have to update all that again. And I got to go through and see what Braintree's changes for all this are, because I would assume they're going to have to introduce some sort of payment intent thing. But from what I've seen, there's nothing. It doesn't talk about it anywhere. So I don't really know. Maybe they're just there's like posts on there about SEA, but like there was not. Like Stripe's got guides, several guides and pages. Like, if you have this type of payments, go through this.
Yeah, and they actually have
Braintree has nothing from what I saw.
Stripe actually not only they have the docs on how to implement it, but they have blog posts about like what SCA is and like why it's being implemented, and that was really helpful. So like
Stripe is awesome.
Yeah, I was gonna say like it's not really inconvenience, like it's part of my job. But like for all the work that is required for it, at least like it still feels like Stripe. Like it's not, the process is different, sure, but it's as Stripified as it could be. Right.
Yeah, I don't know that they could really simplify it anymore. And it was seriously like thrown on them to the point where like they were like July 1st is when we're going to update the docs for the final version. But like, the rulings and stuff are not quite finalized, and we don't know how to properly handle subscriptions because they didn't talk about it, you know. And it was like, what the hell? Like, this stuff is getting crazy, and like the less and less people know about how computers work, and the more and more rules get put into place, our jobs are just going to become, you know, nightmares of duct tape at some point. Feels like. But that's going to be more opportunities to build a company like Stripe, I guess. Like, it feels like things became easier for a time, and now they're getting more complicated. Like, oh, you know, you need a JavaScript framework. You're going to have to build now a React single-page app and a GraphQL API, and you're going to have to write types in your backend and use TypeScript and whatever. And I'm just like, hey, remember those days where like Rails came out and it promised you could build a startup with one developer?
Right.
Let's get back to that, you know? The quality, like the bar is going up, but also so the weird rules and stuff around payments. And I mean, it makes sense, but at the same time, it's not necessarily designed with simplicity in mind.
Yeah.
It's tough.
I mean, I guess the other thing too is we've made it this far on like the air quotes simple method, but like it's starting to, I mean, it's been biting us because fraud's
been awful. Yeah.
Like, so I get it.
Yeah. I mean, it's been it doesn't help that the credit card companies are like, oh, don't worry about it. You know, like, just use your credit card. Don't worry, we'll send you a new one.
Right.
We'll take care of that. No, it's I mean, I'm sure they would have, if they didn't have such massive profits, they wouldn't take on so much fraud. They would actually work harder
Right.
to do this sooner, but it is, it's crazy. It's interesting to see how that stuff's changing. But
Yeah.
anyways,
I thought I'd have a couple of days to not talk about Stripe, and yet here we are.
Yeah, enjoying it. Oh, Stripe. Yeah.
I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to talk about.
Yeah, we didn't really have much of a plan. It's fun to do this in person, though.
Yeah.
I'm excited about, what's the guy's name, Ruby on Jets?
Tongue.
Yeah. Chatted with him a little bit.
Yeah.
And it'll be fun to check that out. We'll have to talk to him more on that because I got kind of excited watching Taylor Otwell's keynote at Laracon about Laravel Vapor, which is fascinating. It's like, from what I could tell, 0 changes to the Laravel framework, and you can deploy it to AWS Lambda along with scalable databases and serverless databases, load balancing, schedulers, whatever.
It'll handle your queues just like, it's crazy.
It felt like, like it didn't. I expected you would have to re-architect everything to work on Lambda, but from the sounds of it, it's like just keep writing Laravel the way you normally do.
So
for the most part.
I read that he made. Somebody tweeted and asked him, and like he made changes to the framework as needed. Yeah. And I think he said, like, to be honest, like, this would be impossible if you didn't own the framework.
Yeah.
Like, because, like, he can just make those changes as a new version.
Yeah, it's like, that'll never sadly happen in Rails. I get the sort of, like, opposition to it, though. Like, you're building something specifically to work on AWS, and there's, like, no necessarily Google Cloud equivalent or Azure or whatever.
Sure.
Maybe he can make it work on those other clouds, but, like, the amount of time you had to spend integrating with AWS, nightmare, I'm sure.
And, like...
It's cool, though. Like, click a button.
You get built-in warnings.
Scaling, and it costs so cheap. It's
it should be way more. Like,
it should be. And everybody's like, talking Kubernetes and Docker and all this stuff. And this is literally like clicking a button, deploy. Don't worry about any of that. But you can also have your Docker file that's like a perfect clone of what actually runs on Lambda. So you can have a, matching environment to test with. And it is cool.
It's so cool.
And it seems like this is like my struggle with all this has been like, what I really want is something like that where I don't have to worry about perfectly configuring Docker and Docker Compose and Kubernetes and Vault and whatever else that I have to do, and then getting that running on AWS and running locally and, worrying about all these different things. Like, I want the Heroku experience, but I want it to be like
serverless.
Well, yeah, like I just want it to be Heroku is expensive. Like, those server costs are pretty high, which is what drove me to like build Hatchbox originally. But it seems like serverless is going, if you have a framework that gets you in that direction, it's going to kind of solve a lot of those problems potentially. I joked about in Slack the other day. I was like, what was it in the ops channel here? Serverless. Future of coding is going to be serverless, deployless, codeless, featureless. And then somebody was like, and then it will be a jobless. Because, there was somebody else that, some startup, a language called Dark, and it has an editor, and it's a brand new language and a platform thing, and it has a unique deployless software model, whatever the hell that means.
Deployless.
That doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't, just like serverless. Like, whatever.
I don't know.
So
I should be more up on the DevOps, but
it just is changing so fast. But then
I don't know anything
all
about
these
Kubernetes.
all these things introduce just as many, if not more, new problems as they solve.
Right.
Like Kubernetes now requires you to go into Docker and set up all kinds of, infrastructure just to run your app. And then it's like, why do that when that's what Heroku's done, and I can just pay them and they'll scale it up for me just as easily, and it's going to cost a bit more per server, but also I don't have to pay DevOps people at all.
Yeah.
They can solve the majority of generic problems like we have, because we're not building Google or Facebook. We're
that's the thing.
Massive.
I have nothing against the Docker and the Kubernetes and stuff like that. Whenever you prepend a word with "the," I feel like you've reached peak old man. The Facebook,
the Docker,
the Walmart,
the Ohio State University.
It's not that I think those things are bad. I haven't personally experienced the need for it.
Yeah.
Personally.
Well, most people don't need it, I think. They want to... It's the hype thing, right? They want for it to be... It's also sold and marketed in a way that it's just use Docker and all your problems are solved. And it's well, not really. Now you have to deal with stuff running slowly in there. I can't count how many times people are things are just not working with Docker.
So let's tie that into what you said earlier about how Adam and Steve, Adam was pushing Steve because he's people should just know that. When you talk about just Dockerize and all your problems go away, you probably I know I forget what it was like to be a beginner programmer sometimes. You forget what it was getting the Docker set up there.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the reason it's marketed like that.
It's also a business. Docker is true, a business. Yeah. They're a company trying to sell you Docker. Every time they get you to use Docker, they make money. So this is, not an open source thing that they're promoting.
Right.
So it's DHH talked about at RailsConf, it is vastly changing where every fucking OpenSSL vulnerability has a logo and a website now, and the world is a very different place where all this level of marketing and stuff is happening on a different scale than it used to. I just listened to a book called Hackers by Stephen Levy, I think.
Is that the one that's binary code on the front?
Maybe.
I'm gonna look in my Kindle.
Black and green.
Yeah.
Matrixy.
I mean, that doesn't really.
But the thing about the book was the hacker culture of information should be free, and how that worked throughout the beginning of computing, up until Steve Jobs and so on, and just the evolution of that, where the original people who hung out at the homebrew computer clubs and things were there just giving away, yep, that's the one.
I haven't read it, I just bought it.
It's a good book. I just listened to it on vacation.
Like everything, I just get it and I never read it.
Yeah. It's a long book, 13, 14 hours.
Sorry, so...
Anyways,
information should be free, and then
it was just things were expected to be given away, software and things, but then you had Bill Gates and other people who were well, we're putting in work for this,
right? So
we should get something out of it. And I don't disagree with that, because we couldn't do what we do right now if all our code was given away for free.
there would be no this conference.
But like, I think like DHH was saying, like we're losing that sort of open source mentality that we used to have a bit more. Like when I started to code in Python and stuff, I was like just out of the fun of contributing back to the Linux community who had helped me like make Linux work on my computer. And I was like, I need to be able to install software on my computer that doesn't have reliable internet. I have dial-up at home. So like I built a Python app, open sourced it, and people used it, and like random people in the government used it for super secure servers that couldn't be connected to the internet. Someone used it in South Africa for a school's computer lab that didn't have reliable internet. And these people would email me about this, and I was like, what? So I eventually like got interviewed in Linux Journal magazine.
Jeez.
And I was like in college when all this happened.
That's
it was
cool.
crazy. And that was like the stuff that happened because I gave away the software for free. Like 150,000 downloads or something. It's nuts, but if you're like trying to sell your software, it's a different thing. And so, like that book kind of got back to all that, like just kind of giving stuff away because it's going to make the world a better place kind of philosophy. And I thought that was interesting. It's kind of how I got into it. But then at some point you're like, God, I could do that because I was in college and living on student loans and like stuff, but now it's like you have to pay the bills.
Right.
We're not doing it necessarily to be a $1 billion startup, but you do have to pay the bills.
Right.
So
yeah, I've been thinking about
life
that
gets
a
more
lot.
complicated.
I have no good answer, but I've been thinking about that.
I don't either, but I think it's a forever kind of battle between the two. One is purely an ideal of, giving everything away, which is great and all, but then how do you measure value? And like money is how we kind of measure that. But then at some point, then people go too far on the other direction of trying to make too much money and selling your data.
Yeah.
Whatever.
I think like people people often ask the question, like, if you had unlimited money, what would you do? And like, I would still want to write code. And like, yeah, I don't know. I've never really thought about I never know how to answer that question, but like, I'd probably just want to write code and give it away. Like,
yeah.
And it's just, I don't know. As life goes on, maybe I make excuses, but it just gets harder to like want to sit down and do like open source because it's like time is so limited.
I agree. It definitely changes because originally it was like the more open source I do, the better my career will be in the future. Like this is all stuff that future employers will see and be like impressed with and stuff. And now I'm kind of in an interesting place that like I can do screencasts, get paid for the education, and as much as that code and stuff that I publish can be free, which is great. So I love being able to do that, but then like it's a lot of work. It's hard. So, at some point you're like, I need help and I need to be able to pay to hire someone to like do this with me. And so it's an interesting thing where at some point you do have to worry about making money and then you can't quite live up to the same like things. But I don't know if this is nostalgia talking or not, but like I always had the most fun coding on open source stuff, just imagining that I'm building something people might appreciate. And then when you're doing it for money, I don't feel the same way. Or when I do it for a job, like it's not just being written because I hope that someone will find it happy. I also or make them happy or something. Like I also now have to get them to give me money in exchange for it. So it doesn't feel as altruistic or something, and like it's not quite as enjoyable or something. It feels like work.
We talked about this a little earlier. I think that, I mean, there are other reasons, but like that also might be part of the reason like I kind of burned out so fast on Jumpstart. Like after that weekend, like I had never made written code that I was like going to sell, like to help others. But like,
yeah, because when you're working a job, you're writing code for your boss,
right?
Who sells it? You know, like you never feel like you're the person who's selling it.
Yeah, I don't know. It was different. I didn't realize that until you just said it. That might.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I had a fun experience when I was freelancing and stuff for people, and then worked with a guy to build a site, and he had it set up so like we would split the revenue we made like 50-50 or something. That was like the very first time when like I got those PayPal emails that were like, hey, you just made $20. And I remember being like, what? Because I walked into the movie theater, sat down, my phone buzzed, and it was like, you just made $20. And I was like, the movie was free? Like, it was mind blowing. At that moment, I was like, I need to sell stuff. So there's like, it's a strange dichotomy or something.
Yeah, because don't get me wrong, like I tell you every time we talk how discouraged I am because I have never like made a product. But yeah, you're right. So there's something like I got to find some kind of middle ground.
Yeah, it's interesting. Feels like part of the like, you know, artists who do it purely for the fun of making art, but then at some point you got to pay your bills. And then like, do they enjoy making art and painting the same way?
Right.
You know, are you worrying about writing your code for what will people buy, or like doing your art for what will people buy versus what you enjoy making? You know, it's a strange thing because I feel like coding for a lot of people is a hobby first, then a career, versus like, you know, if you're going into working in aerospace, like you're doing it probably because it's a career, but you also like planes or something.
Right.
You know, like it's probably not a hobby flying planes.
Did you see that article
as much
that Boeing was paying like software engineers like $9.75 an hour? They were like
that doesn't surprise me.
They were like outsourcing, I guess, or maybe they were paying people. But yeah,
wow.
I was like, well, that doesn't sound good.
Yeah. And that is $9.75, not $975 an hour.
Yeah. Hopped on Upwork and just hit like the $1 sign.
Yeah. Jeez. It's a St. Louis company for you.
Oh, it's St. Louis based?
I don't know if their headquarters there, but I think it is.
Yikes.
Yeah, St. Louis represent.
Is it Boeing? Yeah, it's Boeing. Airbus is the other one. No.
Lockheed Martin. Anyways, we're on our tangents now.
This is when we know it's time.
Yeah. Well,
except for last week when we talked for like 30 minutes before we brought Ernesto into the conversation.
Yeah, sorry, Ernesto.
We were talking about Stripe.
Again. Yeah, I forgot about that. It's funny, I don't remember our conversation week to week sometimes.
I don't. I remember nothing ever.
Well, man, I guess that's it. Workshop day so far was pretty good. And then our conference day tomorrow with...
I'll be busy.
Avdi's keynoting. Jessica Kerr.
Thanks, Kerr.
Good.
She's a fellow St. Louis.
Yeah, I used to see her a long time ago at this St. Louis Ruby meetup or something. That was a long time ago, though.
Yeah.
8 years ago or something.
When meetups were a thing.
Yeah, we were talking about that at lunch, like how our meetups are falling apart. And I was like, there was a time when meetups were really fun. And I haven't been to a meetup in a while now.
Maybe
that's anything like that.
Maybe we just all got tired of doing the same thing every month.
Yeah, maybe we just got old and we're like, you guys are boring.
Old man yells at cloud.
Yeah.
All right, see ya.
All right, later.